yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm good. So cheers, everyone. Here's to the season's last book club. And everyone have a terrific summer. To you, Charles, as well.
All right, thank you for hosting.
With pleasure. Okay.
Ben, I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of your thoughts on this.
Well,
Because I know you're an expert, and I have to say I don't have a full grasp on it because of the way I chose to read it.
Well, that's very kind of you. I'm far from an expert, but this is actually the second time that the Wolf Book Club has discussed this book. And so there was a professor who put together some notes last time. But my questions, I try to do all my questions without looking at anything else first. So I did my questions, and then I saw what we discussed back in 2011. And I made just a few modifications.
2011.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's back in the golden days when we were treated like
You organize all his notes.
Yeah.
Well, what can I say? Actually, what I do is I get when we read something, I tuck the notes away in the book. And so it's easy when I pull out the book, then there are the notes again. That's how I stay organized. So let's get going. So my Ántonia. So as usual, let's do a roundabout on people's top line impressions. Charles, you want to start?
Sure. I didn't have mixed feelings when you suggested it, but I was so pleased that you did once I started reading it. She writes with such, she's like a painter the way she writes. You can see things. So the first part of the book, I don't know, maybe a third or so, didn't grab me as far as people goes. I got a little bit of a sense of who the people were. But then when she started talking about Jim and Ántonia and each of, her mother and her father who commit suicide, it really kind of put a face on everybody that she wrote about. The grandparents, and Jim was kind of like an observer. Even though he lived his own life and he had plenty of things to do and that he did. So I don't know if there's anything profound about what I say about the book, but it was such a pleasant read. It was just a nice read. And then towards the end, it really reached me because when you get to be a certain age, I don't know what that age is, but I'm certainly there. You start thinking about your own life and kind of putting it all together. And it was fascinating to me the way he describes, the people that he knew and the time, the time that had passed. I'm trying to think of. He had one thing. I don't remember now. But I kept on thinking about, great experiences. And when he was at a play and with Lena, and how he just was overwhelmed by his enjoyment. I was back in the amphitheater in 1965 or 66, watching the Broadway production, even though it was in the Village, it was a Broadway production of Man of La Mancha with Jose Ferrer. He wasn't the original, Richard Kiley was. But I couldn't believe that you could do that on stage. So when he was describing his experience watching the stage, it just brought me back, and I think that's what this story is about. It's about memory, and just the things that stick in your mind, and the relationships that you have, and you keep, and you value. Long-winded, but that's what I felt.
And Charles, thank you. First of all, whatever you shared is profound. And also, I have to ask, did you have as hot a dish as Lena with you when you went to your play?
I think I went with Lou Capozzi. So no, the answer was no. No, I've made up for it in years to come, and I married a very lovely woman. In fact, I married two very lovely women, but that's another story.
Not at the same time, I hope.
No, no, what is?
All right, who's up next?
That's Bronson.
Me?
You're in mine. She didn't get to read the whole, she reads very slowly.
Very slowly because okay, but only the first book for now.
Great,
The
congratulations.
first, the
Okay, the first book in the
the
story.
story, yeah.
Uh-huh.
I like it. It's nice about the interesting people, different culture, coming and the how days happy
Mm.
between days. Was nice. It's how they need to adapt it. The people coming, they are immigrants from Europe, for the it's what country they
Bohemia.
Yes. So Tora and to me what's interesting, the one dialogue have Antonia with Jimmy about the how possibilities of food they can make because they consider the family Jimmy rich people because even better, of course. The other people, the family Antonia are poor people. They come in and they beginning new life in this country, and they have discussion between days how it is possible they have the many possibilities, but they don't have the good food. For example, no, was interesting dialogue. And they have the one a little 15 between days about this possibility, better life, but don't have good life. And she said, "Oh, we with in our country we have the how do you have the good food, for example." And other moment was interesting about the religions when they die in Chimerdas, Father Antonia, and I don't remember the boy. He's so gory about the don't come in the father for the church for the sacraments, give the sacraments, and they was nice how they answered. Grandfather Jimmy said, "No need, don't worry. No need to have father. We believe in the connection is directed the people with God for go to heaven." So this was interesting about how different and the people need to adapt to the new life. Okay, Richard, talk to me.
Excellent.
But it's nice, beautiful. I want to continue, of course, but I
Fantastic.
go
Mhm.
slow in the
Yeah.
story.
Well, it's lovely you're here. You're the most recent immigrant in the group here, and so that brings so it brings a perspective
Yeah.
of what it's like with these recent arrivals. And if I'm not mistaken, was it the Methodists who refused to put grandfather Shimerda in the cemetery because of
Oh, yeah.
so that created some waves.
I
So
forgot about that, yeah.
so we have another ringer, and Rick for having grown up in the Midwest. So I don't know how close this pioneering
Right.
experience.
Oh,
is.
good, you can tell us what it's really about.
No, I
And
loved it, but it's not the Midwest I knew. This
Yeah.
Midwest
Mm.
is more West. I mean,
Mhm.
the description of just the feeling of arriving there with the dark and the train
Mhm.
and just nothing, just the road and this land and land and land, it's like, I could really feel kind of desolation there, and the feeling, I'm sure that first took the impression that, where am I?
Mhm.
So I really enjoy the writer, describing these, the scene and then, no, I think I read to rank it, 8 out of 10 maybe, I think, I enjoyed reading this type of book. I like to read, it's, keeps you going, and then I was worried about what's gonna happen to poor Antonia. And, yeah, she's a really beautiful, nice girl, and, is she destined for poverty for her life, and you really don't know, it kind of pulls you through the book to the end, and you find out that, she's happy, she's happy where she's at, and it's a little bit complicated, but she's happy with the way, I don't want to give it away, so hopefully that's bronze reads to the end.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Cool. Out of curiosity, do you have ancestors in the Midwest who arrived as farmers or were farming?
my ancestors are from like Maine, Massachusetts, Maine.
Yeah. Okay. Well, some of them here were from, what was it, New York?
So Virginia, well, it was mentioned Virginia.
But were they farming at first when they came out? Were they homesteading?
Probably, I don't know. I mean, that's all it was.
Yeah. Back then, farming, that's all it was.
The 1600, there was, answers came over first in the 1600s, so.
Yeah. But then when they moved out to the Midwest, maybe it was pioneering days still. Okay. Mark.
So, again, I kind of listened to this as an audiobook, and I didn't listen to it all at once, so it's a lot of bits and pieces, and then I had to go back different times. So I don't have like a good complete picture, but I've got a lot of little impressions. And I feel it was like because I took it as this really kind of an idol, like this pastoral. I like what Charles said about painting, because there are a lot of scenes that sort of come into clarity as almost as paintings, but visual paintings. I mean, motion paintings, but I liked how it went from being sort of this coming of age story to having these really harsh elements in it. And because those were always very, like it surprised me in how dark it would get sometimes with what seemed like a kind of a romantic gloss on, the region and growing up there and all what's happened, the immigration and way that things are formed as a community. And then but it really did have a lot of depth to it, a lot of darkness, a lot of reality to that. I mean, so for something that seemed kind of romantic and idyllic, it had a lot of people that were getting, hooked and crooked and killing themselves. Several people killing themselves in the book, and it's like, and you see it, and it's like, so it was definitely had a harsh side to it, which I thought was really leavening to the other elements of it. And I really liked the way that it showed the immigration experience, like you're talking about, of it's all coming together in a way that it reminds me of being in Miami now, right? But to think that these Midwestern places that we think of as all American were not originally that. They were all these, it was all European coming together, and seeing how that happened was quite interesting. So I think I very much enjoyed it. I'm not sure, that I have great takeaways, and it's a little more than pleasant because the writing was really good, but I will be interested to hear thoughts about it, to hear if maybe it will go further up in my esteem here. I wouldn't call it a favorite. I would just say that I enjoyed it.
Well, what you mentioned about it being disjointed, the critics at the time came out and criticized that it's a novel without form. in that it doesn't follow a sequential from one perspective. It's as Esperanza pointed out, it's a series of books within the books, and they are sometimes completely different narrators. Such as I think it's the neighbor who narrates, and the whole time it's quote unquote or double quoted the story of what happened to Ántonia when she was out west and getting
Right.
jilted.
Yeah,
There's
someone
a
who
whole-
likes to
Yeah.
tell stories.
Yeah, the whole
Yeah.
book is about Lena is almost also kind of different and not the main focus, if you will. So it is a disjointed book.
But even with the ones that, even the parts that are from Jim's perspective, it's like, okay, it's a painting, like Charles was saying, but it's painting with like there's stuff in all the little corners of the painting, and he like goes off into those
Yeah.
corners, and you're hearing all these stories and these characters, and it's like, I mean, it's almost Russian in the way it's incorporating all of these characters one after the other. I had, because of the way I read it, that was a difficulty for me trying to, it's not as bad as trying to keep track of all the names in a Russian novel.
Yeah.
But I did find that sometimes I was like, oh yeah, and I have to go back to that character to remember that story because of the way I read it. But they were all over the place, these little vignettes that sort of all came together to create a pastiche of something bigger. But I don't have the bigger picture yet. I still feel like I'm swimming in a lot of vignettes.
Okay, and it's a curious book because it's a book within a book within a book. So Willa Cather chose to create a female narrator we don't know, but who knows Jim from New York, and also grew up in Nebraska, and then she persuades Jim or motivates him, and then the whole, really almost all the book is Jim's spontaneous. Supposedly he wrote it out without, he says, without any form, without any thought, it just sort of really tumbled out. So it's a stream of consciousness in some way, which is really interesting. But overall, I'd like to say, I think it's a magical book. And I really admire what Willa Cather accomplished in this. It is her favorite of her books. It's the book that really brought her to fame. I read somewhere that it was not very successful financially, but it got picked up by famous critics, and her career never looked back. I have read one other of her books, Death Comes to the Archbishop, which is set in the Southwest. And I think
Wait, didn't we do another one from her as a book club?
I'm not sure.
About a pioneer woman in the Midwest who went to a town. And oh gosh, I'm gonna look it up.
Yeah, nothing here is
I think that was
jumping out. But what I find very interesting is that, well, what little I know about Willa Cather's life, she was an unconventional woman. She was homeschooled, so she never had any formal education. She was homeschooled out at the farm, if you will, out in the country, and eventually had I think it was a Latin teacher come and teach her Latin. But her natural smarts were amazing, such that she eventually matriculated to, I think it was a Nebraska university. She became a tomboy and wore androgynous clothes. Moved to New York, had her hair cut short, and this is in the teens, so it's a little over a century ago. Did you find an earlier book?
A Lost Lady. We read it in 2019.
Okay, cool. I must have been away for that one. I don't recall that. Great. And so she brings a very interesting perspective of someone who pretty much just like Jim, she as a young child moved out to Nebraska. She grew up there, and then like Jim, she migrates back to the East, where she attains success. But her heart is back in Nebraska. And her first couple of novels didn't get into that taproot, but once she got into the taproot of her memories, and they're very elegiac, and it's astounding, the imagery, the painterly images of the prairie and the sunsets and etc. And it's an amazing book for just being completely emotion filled, but without a conventional form, or even story. So I think it's a masterpiece. It's a classic of what the pioneering life was like in the U.S. And even that is told from a very interesting perspective that maybe we'll get into. So all right. So
I think you should read A Lost Lady, though.
okay, cool.
My recollection
Uh-huh.
is, did you read A Lost Lady, Charles, with us
No,
years ago?
no.
My recollection is, at the time, I felt a stronger connection to A
Yeah.
Lost Lady.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
for whatever easily explained reasons, but I think probably because of some similarities,
Yeah.
you should probably give it a go.
With pleasure. Because I find Cather a delight. All right, so let's get into some questions. So how about the first one? And I mentioned this, that there's a framing device. And so why do you think that Cather uses this framing device of transcribing Jim Burton's narrative, substantially as he brought it to me? Which, by the way, means it's not exactly as he brought it to her. So why, any thoughts? Why did Willa Cather choose to give a male perspective on this whole story, and Jim Burton's specifically?
Well, one reason I think is that it's not exclusively a male perspective. And so by doing it this way, she's kind of making accommodation for the imprint that she's put on it. So it's the story from his perspective. Why did she choose his perspective? I think he's best placed for it. I think it's a practical solution, unless there's other reasons that I'm not thinking about. But then having it come through other voices allows her to, go into. I mean, I don't know if the way that things would trail off poetically in the chapter ends and beginnings, I don't know if that's him or her. But it feels like it's got a feminine touch to it, or certainly a very sensitive aesthetic.
Yeah, and of course there's a female narrator who gives the introduction. So Willa Cather is controlling the marionettes all from above, but supposedly we have a female narrator who said that she was going to write something herself, never did. And when she only put down some notes, she confesses in her introduction. But then when she gets Jim's work, she's like, hey, that's better than anything I can do. I'm not going to try to meld things together. What he did was by itself a full story. But any other thoughts on the framing device? I mean, why didn't Willa Cather why wasn't she the narrator? Why was it like?
If it just started right into the book, and didn't say that, would it be any different?
Mhm.
To me, I don't know the difference.
Yeah.
If it skipped that whole part,
Yeah.
what is? I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
That's a very good point, Rick, because actually I learned in this is a 1993 edition, and it was the first. It's a Bantam classic. It was the first to reincorporate the introduction, which had been taken out of the authorized version, authorized by Willa Cather back in the 1920s. So it was published in the teens. It went through some changes. The introduction was dropped so that it was just purely Jim's story. And it was dropped with Willa Cather's approval. But at least it sounds like all of our versions now include the restored introduction, which helps put this framing device back. Charles,
You know,
any thoughts?
it's interesting you say that, because when you started talking about a narrator, I hadn't, because my version I got out of the Miami Shores library, and it doesn't have an introduction.
Okay.
It just starts book one. I first heard of Ántonia on what happened to me, and then when he's on the train. So I never thought of it as anything particularly but Jim's voice.
Excellent. Well, then you got one of the old versions before 1903. So
Well, I don't know if it was that or what, but it's in it was in the library. It looks like it had bigger print and such. I mean, not like the large print, but there was no introduction. Went right into it.
Well, Charles, the one thing that I recall from the introduction, and that's now a month ago, but it sticks with me, that you might enjoy is, and maybe this is the reason for having it, is that he brings the stack of papers, and puts it down, and he has on there Ántonia, and then he adds on, while he's standing there with this woman, my Ántonia, which
It's interesting. I'm going to try to find it. I'm going to try to find the introduction.
But that really, makes you very aware, all the people who say my Ántonia at different points in the book, and whose Ántonia are we looking at here,
Yeah. It's a little bit like Kurosawa's Rashomon. It's like what perspective is this the real Ántonia? Or is this Jim Ántonia?
Why? Yeah, of course. Why did she take it out? Do you know?
I don't.
And probably the editors
No, yeah, so the editors
suggested taking it out, and she went along with it. But I think that if for nothing else, that fact of jotting my on there, and it's like, this is my Ántonia, and I think that really added something to me.
Well, this whole framing device, I think it is unconventional, particularly for when it was published. I agree with the editors who now put it back in, and we'll get into some other reasons on why I think the introduction really helps our understanding a lot of the book. Yeah, Charles?
Without even seeing it, I know it does, because I hadn't seen it. And now I know he wanted to have it written. He didn't write it, just like the professor he had, who was going to write but didn't write, and just wrote some poetry. So him bringing all those sheets of paper, as you describe it, he wanted to have the world know this. It wasn't just a fictional account. It was something that he thought was worthwhile for the world to know.
Yeah. And in the introduction, we learn a little bit about Jim and his career and his marital life. So just to give a few of my thoughts on question one, I think, Mark, you touched on a couple of them. Yeah, this is a very unconventional love story, and I'll get into that further. But to have the love story told by a female author, the love object being Ántonia, would have been difficult at the time, it might have interfered with the appreciation of Ántonia. So it's a conventional. All right, we're going to have a male who's describing his love for this recent immigrant, and so I think that is one reason. It makes the love story a little more accessible to us. I also think that the book is filled with a kind of feminine energy and emotion, and to therefore give it a little bit more accessibility and balance, she puts it into the perspective, terminology, background of a male. And so I think there's some reasons why she chose to do that, not just for the period, that to tell us a love story, a woman of a woman would have been rare, but also that the story already was an emotional filled one, And to give a male narrator gives a little bit of balance and I don't know, weight that it might have lacked. So anyway, but it's real interesting that this was added, that was in the original. She was persuaded, I'm sure, to take it out by the publishers of the day, but that it's now made it back in. So here's a big subject. The book explores the subject of the assimilation of recent immigrants into the American mainstream. How is the subject of assimilation viewed? And I agree with Mark. We're living in similar days and of mass migration,
We were.
right?
Were until this year.
We were until recently.
But you know, we're all feeling the impact of that. And so how are things, how does how does Cather's view of assimilation strike you? And also, how does it differ perhaps from some of the people in Black Hawk?
Well, it reminds me of what Patrick Moynihan said, the senator, and he said that America is really not a melting pot; it's a tossed salad.
Mm.
And there was real separation. Uh, the immigrants had to earn their way into the society. They weren't necessarily welcomed. Jim's grandparents were an exception, basically, the way they welcomed them. One of the things that struck me, because it happened to my family, uh, my grandparents came to this country in 1905, and they settled in the Lower East Side, where that was the most densely populated place in the whole wide world, more than Calcutta. And my Aunt Lily did not learn how to speak English until she went to public school and was taught by an Irish teacher, because in their house they spoke Yiddish. And when and they brought the culture. And I still remember my grandfather, he used to put a sugar cube in his mouth and drink tea through the sugar cube in a glass. And so I'm not, you know, I'm not that far removed from that experience. My father was born in Poland. And when he came here, he had an accent. When he died, he still had the accent. So he was a soldier. He's fought in World War II. I mean, all the things of America. But there is still a separation. There was always a separation between the immigrant and the people who had been here before. Uh, but I was so taken back by the kindness of Jim's grandparents and their tolerance for her parents and how difficult they were, especially her mother, and how they kept on being kind to the people despite not necessarily having it returned in the same way, especially by Antonia's brother. Uh, but when the farm girls, the Swedes, the Bohemians went to town, they weren't assimilated quickly. They had to earn their presence. Um, at any rate, I thought that was a fascinating part of the book, you know. But what was also fascinating was, I'm sure that what brought them to this area, I'm not sure, but I remember reading, were in Europe. The way they described the farmland, you could throw seeds down and it would grow everywhere. And this is just Nebraska. They were saying that about South Dakota and all of that. And these people came and they were absolutely shocked. Just like, people went to the cities, it wasn't, gold in the street. They had to work hard and they were very, very poor. So, but was also interesting it was that how the guys that came 10 years earlier cheated the people who came 10 years later. you know, when they bought this piece of property, Antonia's parents, they overpaid for it. And it was a really, you know, a crummy deal for them. And the person who had sold it was an immigrant who came 10 years earlier. At any rate,
Yeah,
I thought it was a wonderful description of the immigrant experience and how they really have to work their way into society.
and I'd like to add, while Antonia's experience is not technically homesteading, I think that the Bohemian who sold to them might have been a homesteader, but essentially this is very recent homesteading. And think of living in a sod house.
Oof.
You know, in the winters there. For one of my projects, I drove all along the Canadian border on the US side, and I went to a pioneering museum in North Dakota, right up by the border with Canada. And it had and it showed the migrations from all of Northern Europe, how most of them came across and made it. I'm not even, that might have even gone through Greenland, but then came over to Nova Scotia, then traveled through Canada, and then came down. People would die on the trip to get here, and some of them thought they were coming to paradise when in fact, yes, they could own land, which they could never have done in however many generations back in Europe, but it was hard work. And
Oh, yeah.
to see what hard sod houses were like was amazing. So this was extreme hardship by today's standards, right? And yet they survived. And you mentioned how your grandparents, I would go beyond that, they thrived. I like that you mentioned your grandparent didn't learn English until going to school. That's what Antonia's kids are doing. They are speaking Bohemian, we learn towards the end of the novel, at home, and only when they go to public school do they learn English. And it goes further. The country girls, when they get into Black Hawk, I think that it says that they disturb the social fabric of the town. And partly because they were beautiful and energetic, and it tells the story of how they're being out in the sun and out in the country just gave them this whole, which is a very romanticized but also beautiful image of these young women who are hardy, pioneering, and charming and different, and how they then came to Black Hawk, and not only did they survive, they thrived. So even though no boy would marry them because they were so hidebound in their own culture or family or whatever pecking orders, everyone wanted to dance with them. So they were the talk of the town. The Antonia, Lena, and Tiny. But anyway, I'm talking too much.
No, I love seeing that through his eyes too, because he, you know, for him that was like just nirvana. So I love it was this multicultural nirvana of gorgeous European women from everywhere.
But I must say that
Maybe you're gonna say something.
yeah.
No,
Rick.
okay.
No. Okay.
So what I will say, remember, Antonia was the only one who had a little bit of English in the family. And it was a matter of survival, life and death, pretty much. They all had to learn English. There was no choice, and Antonia was the one with Jim's help who picks it up the most quickly, and helps them through a lot of stuff. But yeah, you know, so there's like this social pecking order that they upset, and then also the novel goes on to suggest that the farmers who homesteaded and stuck it through were the ones who turned into the most successful businessmen in the region. So those who went into Black Hawk and did normal businesses and thought well of themselves did okay, but those who really did well were these immigrant homesteaders and farmers who came in. And then, of course, the 2 out of 3 of the immigrant country girls, hired girls, do spectacularly well in material success, Lena and Tiny. So you know, so it's a story of unexpected kind of, you know, reversals, if you will. All right, so how about less of a assimilation story, and the book turns into one long love story, but as I kind of mentioned before, it's a very unconventional one. And any thoughts on that?
I don't really see it as a love story, as Jimmy
Mm.
fantasized about
Yeah.
her, but
Mhm.
they never had an affair or anything,
Mhm.
so where's the love story?
There you go. So that's why it's unconventional.
Yeah.
Yeah, he kissed her once,
Uh-huh.
and she's like, "You can't kiss me like that."
Uh-huh.
Lena lets me. Well, I'll scratch her eyes out.
That's
None of us
right.
are gonna kiss you like
Right.
that.
Remembering that she was in, like, what, a couple of years at
For
least.
4 years.
4 years.
Uh, But
Yeah.
It's like the babysitter fantasy.
so yeah, it's unconventional. But remember that Jim downloads this whole experience. Why? Because Antonia for him means everything about his childhood and upbringing. So she becomes the symbol. So she is, unrequited love, it may be, but it is love.
Oh, I definitely think that it's love. I don't think it's romantic, obviously, but don't we all have friends, even of the same sex or of an opposite sex, that that we're friends with, that we love,
Mhm.
that if they died, we would cry. I mean, they're not family, but they're friends. You know, when I dated, you always had to be careful, as a buddy of mine said, to get in the friend zone with a girl. Because if you got in the friend zone with a girl, that's as far as it was going to go. I mean, we're friends. I remember saying one time when I took a girl home, and I went to kiss her, and she said, "No, it's exactly what Antonia. No, no, we're friends." And I remember what I said, because I was a wise guy teenager. I've got enough friends. I'm not looking for friends.
Uh,
So this book evoked so many memories, so much, and if you read this, I've never been to Nebraska. I've never been to Bohemia, but I could identify with so much of this, and I definitely think it was a love story. I think it was a love story that transcended time, because he didn't see her for 20 years, and the moment he saw her again, and she was rough and she wasn't beautiful and all of that, and he still loved her, and he planned on becoming kind of a surrogate uncle to his children, to her children. Want to take them hunting and this and that. Oh, I think it's one of the greatest love stories I ever read.
Excellent. I love it that you're getting into it there.
Well, when I'm saying uncle, I think of them as like brother and sister more than as I didn't feel like there was ever any real chance of them.
Mhm.
I didn't. It's not a sexual
Mhm.
story at all. That's the one thing. It goes realistic in terms of violence, and
It could have been back in their teen years.
What?
but
I mean,
but
It
it,
couldn't be so
You were
sexual.
thinking, I mean, I was thinking,
It
you know,
could
is
have
this gonna happen?
right, but it didn't. It was just a fantasy
Right.
Yeah.
because he was 13 and she was 17 when she came to town. When they both came to town, so 13 and 17. That's a big gulf. That's why I call it babysitter territory. That's like you're it's not realistic.
Are we talking about personal experiences here, Mark?
Absolutely.
Come on. We
Absolutely. I
we
had
got
a
to bring it
babysitter
to life
when I was
here.
a youngster, and it's like, yeah, you can have a crush on your babysitter, but it's not real because they're dating guys their age. So I didn't. I just thought of it as a fantasy, and ultimately as a sibling kind of a relationship.
Okay. Well, I see that Charles and I are the romantics here of the group.
Well, you see it as a
Yeah, major.
true major, a real love
And
story.
remember, while they go to town at that young age, when Jim is at university, So now he's late teens, it's not quite clear, maybe he's already early twenties. They meet again, and that's when he confesses even more love for her. So it's so by that point it was no longer puppy love, it was something else. But let's get to that.
Okay.
But I will say
he would have been open to more for sure.
interesting. Willa Cather, and somehow there's one review that I must have cut out before the first book club meeting about this book. And Willa Cather apparently was not shy about talking about her work, because I've been just like there's interviews in my introduction, they talk about her talking about her work, and here the reviewer talks about her talking about her work, and she admitted that early reviewers, Cather joked, thought my Ántonia would interest only the Nebraska State Historical Society. Okay, with quote, now so she's speaking, no love affair, no courtship, no marriage, no broken heart, no struggle for success. It lacks the usual staples. So that's why it's an unconventional love story for back then, and for today. And why do I say that even in his 20s, I think it is, he was still completely stuck on her, but he didn't quite have the bravery. At least in my book, it's, well, here we are. It's chapter 4, it must be the last book, in which he confesses to her. I told her I knew she would. Quote, do you know, Ántonia, since I've been away, I think of you more often than of anyone else in this part of the world. Notice the qualifier. I'd have liked you to have, I have liked to have you for a sweetheart or a wife or my mother or my sister, anything that a woman can be to a man. The idea of you is a part of my mind. You influence my likes and dislikes, all my tastes, hundreds of times when I don't realize it. You really are a part of me. Now, when I read that at first, it seemed like, well, that's kind of like his nice way of saying, hey, Ántonia, if I weren't like such a successful guy and you would like an unsuccessful immigrant woman, maybe something could have happened. Like his nice way of saying, hey, I just want to let you know, you really were like a big part of my childhood. No, in reflection, I think he's saying, wow, if I'd had the courage, if I'd been able to overcome some things, you would have been the love of my life.
See, that doesn't surprise me. He definitely was open to that.
Yeah.
From the 13-year-old fantasy stage to later on. But she was not open to it. And I do kind of wonder why she went into an arranged marriage. Like, why would she turn down this person who really wants and loves her to just go with a random arranged marriage with someone she'd never met?
Yeah.
I didn't quite understand.
Well,
said that.
I think that happens after this. So he's back from college. He sees, he's now a little more mature.
It definitely happens later, but why would she?
He's brushing her off with that. He said, I would have like that. In this part of the world, you're the one who like, I already have a new.
So you're
world.
saying he's past that.
You say this is a fancy brush off.
Well, that she might have interpreted it that way. And so I think somewhat correctly, but I think it's because he didn't have the courage. It's a confession, but he didn't have the courage to actually follow through on his own desires, wants, and to overcome whatever prejudices he had about marrying a uneducated Bohemian woman.
It's funny. It's funny you say that, because I never once thought that. I'm not saying it's not accurate, but I never once thought of it. I never thought of him thinking that she was less than him, either in intellect, strength of doing things, or potential. And I don't think it was an arranged marriage, by the way. I think that they courted.
Yeah.
The railroad guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why she chose him? Who knows? I mean, it's clear they got very close. She became pregnant by him, so
Mm.
uh, didn't have great luck with this guy. But
It was
I don't know. I'm
difficult.
sticking with the romantic. I'm sticking with the romantic. I think he loved her on page 15 on.
Yeah.
And the last page, he showed his love for her that had continued.
Yeah.
So that's it. I'm going with it. I'm
Okay.
not changing.
I the same thing. I thought, but even in the passage you read, I thought she still looks at him as one of her children, like one of the kids that she's kind of shepherding along.
Yeah.
And not as a romantic
That
possibility.
that could have been.
And then she goes off and makes a terrible choice. But yeah, I don't know. I would have to have a better grip on the whole thing to.
But remember, guys can be turned down, and if you really think that this is the love of your life,
You persist.
you persist. So I'm suggesting, yes, he was told not to kiss her when he was 13 or whatever. It was slapped back.
15 by that point.
Okay.
Yes.
Good memory. But at a certain point, he was the one who lacked the courage. And Charles, I just wanted to add, when you read the introduction, and we'll get into this in a moment, I think it adds some real layering to this, because we learn how completely unfulfilled Jim is in his marriage.
Yeah, I had no feeling whatsoever.
And it's done subtly. It's not like in your face, but that's one of the questions that's coming up. So,
But was what he was very ambitious.
yeah,
He was very ambitious, and those are the choices he made. He went to college, then he went off to college in Harvard and went to law school. And as sometimes this happens, I mean, it's happened in all of our lives. In 20 years past, I thought about seeing her, but I didn't see her for 20 years. So you say, how could you love somebody and not see him for 20 years? I think it happens all the time. But I think he was more ambitious than he was actually in love. So he chose his own ambition, but he traveled the world. I was kind of surprised that he didn't have anything more. At least it wasn't described with Lena. I thought for sure they were going to have something going,
yeah.
but it just seemed like they were social buddies.
And again, my perspective on that is that Lena, when she says she's never going to get married, then Jim was like, "Oh, okay, all right."
I wasn't quite thinking of marriage.
She would have been a great catch. He missed the Ántonia boat. He could have gotten the Lena boat, but he missed out on that also. So actually, let's jump, and we can come back to the one. But how about question 5?
That's why I think the book is a little bit asexual. With all these settings, I don't really have a good handle on why, on this whole sexual attraction thing that's going on there.
Yeah.
You're just getting little bits and pieces of it.
It's
I think that's partly of the era that was written in. They didn't really want to explicitly write about that. You needed to kind of keep it in subconscious, just let it come out without, because you might get banned if you write too explicit sexual
That's very
situations.
True. Very true.
But also, I'm going to stick up for an unrequited love story. I think that Hollywood movies today, a love story has to include like hot, heavy, naked sex at some point. Otherwise, it's like there's like no way that's an actual love story. But how about this? Well, there we go. Number 5, despite the hardships and disappointments of Antonia's experience, does Cather imply who turned out more fulfilled, Jim or Ántonia?
Ántonia.
Agreed?
because she just, I mean, unconventionally, but she
Yeah.
loved what, you know, her place in life at the end with all the kids and
Yeah.
the farm and
Yeah.
being busy and gym. And
And
sort of, no, and, you know, it just seemed to me.
I agreed entirely. And think, even among the three hired girls, country girls who came in and made a sensation in Blackhawk, she's the only one who ends up poor. Both Lena and Tiny become wildly successful. They're out in San Francisco. One spent 10 years in the Klondike gold rush, made a mint of money. So they're like entrepreneurial, way successful women. But Antonia is one who seems completely
Still poor, but
fulfilled.
a little better, you know, better than, you know, she was originally, so they had the farm and.
Yeah, and she overcame being jilted and having a bastard son, which was a big black mark.
Daughter,
Daughter, thank you. And that's a huge
Martha.
black mark back then. So I mean, everyone was disappointed that a girl with so many gifts and natural talents had made such a huge mistake. And so the book is quite dramatic because for a while then you're like, oh wow, so Antonia is just gonna go like end up in the ditch. She already is in the ditch, and there's no recovering from it. But then when Jim comes back and visits her 20 years later, it's something different. Now the introduction gives some of these details, but I will just quote this reviewer has a pretty harsh view of Jim's life. He says, quote, Jim's life, this is the reviewer speaking, meanwhile, is as barren as hers is rich. Mismarried, childless, unloved, unloving, he cherishes a happier past. And he's a wildly successful corporate lawyer, married to an heiress. And in the introduction, the female narrator tips us off quite soon. She says that she's kept up with Jim, but doesn't see him that much. Why? Because she really doesn't like his wife. And then she goes into some detail on what a like non-entity the wife is, who tolerates Jim and his passions, and for some reason doesn't dump him, even though her behavior is such that she really has no real interest in the man. So
You all have an advantage on me because you have this introduction, but I'm always concerned with dichotomies or choices. Why can't they both have been fulfilled? We have to pick one. The one thing about Antonia that struck me is how happy her family is. They're really happy. Everybody, at least, and she married a good man. He wasn't a Rhodes Scholar, but he seemed like, he loved his children. And, there was the line where, Martha, he loved Martha as if she was his own. And obviously they had a pretty good, or at least active sex life that produced a bunch of kids. So it's not a life I'd want that Antonia had. And from what you're saying about the introduction, because I don't really know from just reading the book, you don't really know about Jim's life. There's nothing in it that he's kind of like a voyeur of everybody else, once he gets to be an adult. So the next time we see each other, well, you don't have the book, at least the introduction, but Ben, you'll let me borrow your book with the introduction.
With pleasure.
It's a very short
Yeah.
introduction, if I recall.
Yeah. So
Well, I'll go to Books and Books and sit in the back for 10 minutes and figure
Oh
it out.
yeah, you could browse for 5 minutes and get it. Yes, you could.
Well, my lips get tired. I got to rest.
all right. So look, going back to question 4, because one of the reasons I admire this book is this turning things on their head.
Yeah.
What was seen as success in Black Hawk was not true success. All right. So the hardship of the homesteaders who did the hard work and tilled the land, they were the ones who became the real even materially successful ones. But then Jim, we learn, leads a very successful life in material, worldly aspects, but maybe desperately unhappy.
Hmm.
And so it gets to this question, quote, who are the nobility of this startling tale?
Well, I think the grandparents were nobility
Yeah.
because they were so, well, they took in their grandson, which probably seems like, well, of course they did, but didn't always happen that way. They welcomed the Shamiga family, and again they were very generous to them when it was difficult. Uh, but Antonia had the ability to overcome hardship, and it's interesting who the two, well, of course her husband, but putting him aside, the two men that she loved and she thought of every day, or I don't know if she thought of Jim every day, but her father. And you talk about tragedy. Here was somebody who was in Europe, who was cultured of some sort, and he came to the United States, and he was living in a sod house. He really couldn't handle it. I mean, he kills himself. Um, he wanted to go back. He wanted his friends. He wanted to be somebody, and he found himself in the United States for whatever reason, and he wound up being a nobody. But so he couldn't overcome the disappointment, but she could overcome it. So my vote would be for her as nobility, Antonia.
But when you say nobility, so they're all starting out like from scratch, right? They're all starting out on a prairie with whatever they can scratch out of the land. And, and they may have culture. Some of the older generation bring culture and nobility of that type from Europe. But really it's about, so what do they create nobility out of their lives? And I think in a way they all do. All of the characters that he focuses on, the lead characters, end up with a sort of nobility. I mean, his is kind of the just through achievement, and the others through their own through just independence, and the ladies who independence and entrepreneurial, and just their attitude. There's a nobility to that. But I don't know. I mean, nobility doesn't seem like the right frame because they're all entrepreneurial, starting from nothing. They're more like Horatio Alger stories than about nobility per se. And then of course Antonia ends up not at all wealthy, but still very, she's the queen of the household. So she's got, all these kids who idolize her. So, I mean, I don't know. I'd be interested to know why you choose that frame and what you see in it.
With pleasure, because nobility, I use it ironically, because as you're implying, we normally think of nobility as something to associated with wealth, whether past wealth or current wealth, and I'm thinking more of a life-giving kind of nobility. And one of the reasons I find this book and reading it again now so fascinating, in some ways it's very contemporary. It's anti-elitist. It's populist. All of the elites do not come out very well in this story. So the heiress wife, from the introduction, we get a pretty clear idea that, wow, that traditional sense of she's nobility by most conventional standards. And boy, what a bad match that was for Jim. And so the it's raising up people who we normally would have thought, and I'm talking now what Willa Cather is doing, whom we normally would think of as just being, okay, that's the common man. Now they help settle the Midwest and whatnot, but hey, they're not going to be in any history book. They didn't go to school, they didn't go to Harvard, they didn't go to graduate school. Essentially, all of those who have normal factors of success aren't really that noble. And the noble ones are the homesteader, the housewife, the hired girls, and the farmhands. So each of them are treated, I think, with a certain nobility that I really appreciate. That for me was like what really makes the novel.
Yeah.
I got it down, yeah.
All right.
I don't understand the question or anything. Glad you
So-
explained it.
So it's kind of flipped on its head.
Yes.
Well, and it is a startling tale, as I mentioned. Okay, so last question, and then we can have entertain any thoughts or questions that are more fun. So my Ántonia is a treatise on memory. How does the book's epigraph from Virgil, "Optima dies prima fugit," the best days are the first to flee, tie to this theme? So I think, was it you, Charles, who said right in your first thoughts, or maybe it was Mark, that this book just saturated it with
That was
memory.
Charles.
Yeah,
Charles.
was saturated with memory that then stimulates our own. There's a little bit like Proust's Madeleine in the beginning of Recherche de le temps perdu.
Don't you be talking dirty.
It's a
Don't
little
you be talking
pastry, and just the smell of that pastry takes Proust or the narrator then down memory lane such that he creates about 1,500 pages of one of the most interesting novels of classic literature, all based on what the smell of a Madeleine brought back to him, and then all of his childhood memories flooded behind that. So this too is a book on memory.
I would like Charles to start us on this one because you did bring it up, Charles.
Well, now that I've heard about the introduction, no, seriously, Jim, his best days were the days that before he became wealthy, before he became a partner in some Wall Street firm, before he became a patron of the opera or whatever he was. These were the days that were his happiest. And I don't know about anybody else, but when I'm feeling down, I sometimes go back to happy times. Both of you people, all of you folks live very close to where many of my happiest memories took place, Flamingo Park. As a matter of fact, I was the legend in my own mind in Flamingo Park.
So I hear.
You hear.
Flamingo Park.
And tomorrow morning, I have breakfast with most of the guys who I went to high school with. Not most of the guys, but all the guys at breakfast. There's 8 of us. Probably 6 will show up tomorrow, and we go back. Not in any morbid way, but do you remember? You remember that dance? And I think that memory serves a great purpose if they're good memories, because it brings you to a happy point. When you were talking about the smell of food. I was in North Carolina, and I hope you don't mind me telling these little vignettes of my life because I find them interesting because they're my life. But I got hungry, and we went into this restaurant, and of all places in Bumble Nowhere, North Carolina, they were serving Eastern European food. Now, my aunt was a great cook, and it's the reason why the Jews have survived, because if we could survive our diet of starch and fat and such like that, we will survive anything. And I walked in, and it had on the menu pierogi,
Yeah.
or as I grew up with the word kreplach. and it's a Central European, Eastern European food, and they cooked it for me, and I ate a portion, and I was back on six at 1041 8th Street at our kitchen table, and I went back to speak to this Polish cook, and I asked her if she would like to live with us. I said, "Can we take you back to Miami?" So I like memories. I mean, some of them I try to get out of my mind of the unhappiness, and I think now knowing that Jim was lonely and Jim was, didn't have a real love marriage. I can understand why he wanted to live to some extent in the past. It was a better memory. All the money in the world can't buy you happiness. You can rent it for a little while, but you can't buy it. But so memories are so important, and that's what this book is about. That's
We
and
look
when
at
when it goes see, I just say one more thing. When it goes see the family that she created, I didn't sense any envy of her for him, but I certainly sensed envy in him for her because of all these kids and everything, and you just he didn't have that apparently in his life. So that's my take on memory.
let me add a little something here. So, Optima dies prima fugit is the epigraph. It also comes up in the novel itself,
Mm.
and it's in the book titled Lena Lingard. And so I forget what's the name of the main town there in Nebraska. So
Lincoln.
Lincoln. So Jim is a student, and Lena has now reestablished contact and comes over and visits. And boy, is she, wow, what an impact she makes. So let me just read a couple of lovely paragraphs about this idea of memory. When I turned back to my room, the place seemed much pleasanter than before. Lena had left something warm and friendly in the lamplight. How I loved to hear her laugh again. It was so soft and unexcited and appreciative, gave a favorable interpretation to everything. When I closed my eyes, I could hear them all laughing. The Danish laundry girls and the three Bohemian Marys. Lena had brought them all back to me. It came over me as it had never done before, the relationship between girls like those and the poetry of Virgil. If there were no girls like them in the world, there would be no poetry. I understood that clearly for the first time. This revelation seemed to me inestimably precious. I clung to it as if it might suddenly vanish. As I sat down to my books, that must be a study book, at last, my old dream about Lena coming across the harvest field in her short skirt seemed to me like the memory of an actual experience. It floated before me on the page like a picture, and underneath it stood the mournful line, Optima dies prima fugit.
Mm.
So
Go ahead.
yeah, so the question is, what does this epigraph mean in terms of this book?
Let me see the book for a second.
Sure. So
This-
remember, it's
this might have an audio
the
book.
best days.
This is a Latin term.
Yes. So it's Virgil, and it's translated, the best days are the first to flee. So he's having this one incredible memory stimulated by Lena's visit. And then he's realizing, you know what, these girls, they're the muses. They're the source of all poetry. Without girls like that, there would be no poetry. But then he goes at the very end, the mournful thought, the best days are the first to flee.
So the chapter before this is when he first says that quote. Okay, just literally the very first.
Okay.
It was the day before, in the
You're right.
days before he was
Right.
in the classroom,
Yeah.
and I propped open my book open and stared listlessly at the page of the Georgics where tomorrow's lesson began. It opened with the melancholy reflection that in the lives of mortals, the best days are the first to flee. Optima dies prima fugit. I turned back to the beginning of the third book, which we had read in class that morning. Primus, blah, 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 blah. For I shall be the first, if I live, to bring the muse into my country. And then he goes on to explain that book. And I think it's very interesting that he ties those things together. And I feel like I mean, here he's a university student. So I thought he was like going to be a writer, and he's going to write about this time because he can't stop thinking about. I mean, he just goes on to talk about how, he can't go into the world of ideas. He keeps being brought back to the interpersonal, the real things, the people from his childhood that crowd his life, his mind. And so I feel like he's bringing the muse back to his country. And in that sense, I'm a little surprised that he waits until he's, many, many years later to do that. But obviously those first memories didn't flee.
Well,
And
Rick,
they didn't flee until he could write them down because they lived with him constantly. So in a way, those two quotes are almost in conflict with each other.
But it's not that the best memories are the first to flee, it's the best days are the first to flee. Okay, so it's speaking about what gets turned into memory.
Oh, okay. Then I understand it better. Okay.
Is my reading of that.
That makes sense. And then you hold on to that with passion and want to bring it back. Yeah.
And exactly right. So if they're the very best days are the first to flee, then what's this? And by the way, the quote that you did about bringing the muse to one's country is exactly what Willa Cather did. Right. So as I quoted earlier, that she had joked that she thought the book would only be well liked by the Nebraska Historical Society, but that in fact it changed her career. That she did one book about Bostonians and nobility and another one about London something or another, and then she went home to the.
Got to read Lost Lady.
There you go. Back to the root,
really
if you will. I will. With pleasure.
but thinking about. Oh, I'm sorry. You were still talking. I'm sorry.
Just one more thought. If the best days are the first to flee, then what do? They have to be recreated. All right. So if they're the first to flee, then you recreate them. And memory is a way to recreate them.
Right.
And writing is a way to recreate them.
The thing, though, is he's a very disciplined person in this book. And when Lena interferes with his growth as a student and he can't concentrate anymore, the professor who, is going to be going to Harvard sees that. And if he had to choose between the enjoyment of Lena and his upward mobility and his future, and as he sees it, he chooses his future and his upward mobility, and he goes with this professor to Harvard and to Harvard Law School. And why does he take 20 years to see somebody who I still consider the love of his life? Because his career became more important for him. And so to me, when he goes see this happy family of 10 children or whatever, all the material wealth he had, all the status he had, all of the, whatever else, it didn't give him any emotional fulfillment. And, but it was his fault. He always allowed his career to come first. I'm sure it was that way. I don't know if in the introduction, which now has become classic in my mind, whether they speak about, was there ever any love between him and his wife? Or did he marry her because it was a step up on the status ladder?
On the emotional intelligence level, I would say that having pursued Lena and given up his career would have been not the smartest thing to do.
Yeah.
But again, this book turns everything on its head in some ways. So
You know, guys have done dumber things for infatuations.
Well, he was, I guess, still, his heart was still with Antonia. So even
Yeah, but his body was with Lena.
the
You know,
body, that was the same thing that happened when they were at the dancing, though. Like Lena lets me kiss her, like this, and but he still wanted Antonia. So
well,
that's what he really wanted. So.
and to help us understand why he could disappear for 20 years from Antonia's life, if I understand the sequence, he goes to Harvard, he leaves, he thinks that Antonia is a destroyed woman.
Yeah.
Okay. He I would guess is fearful.
Yes.
He's not searching out to see what like a mess she became.
No, it's Lena that said, go see her.
Yeah, and so he's terrified of the idea of, well, this image that I have of this beautiful young girl, was
destroyed.
Exactly. And so that is perhaps the motivation for waiting 20 years. And then he had the courage. So he lacked the courage when he had an opportunity with, I think, Antonia to really make a long-term relationship. Then he didn't have the courage to make a long-term relationship with Lena, but he finally had enough courage to go back and see and meet her. And from the sound of it, his life actually takes on some meaning after that.
he's going to go hunting with the boys.
Exactly, and not just that, but then meeting the female narrator and writing this book. And he's not a writer, but then he produces something that is wow. First time writer, he's just a corporate lawyer and he writes this out like in a stream of consciousness or whatever.
Did you hear that, Charles? Just a corporate lawyer.
Listen, it reminds me of when I have three children, and one of them is a very very successful photographer. The second one is an actress who's had some success and now is raising a family, so basically just teaches. And the third one went to Johnson and Wales, and became a chef, although he's not involved in that right at the moment. And somebody said to me, where'd they get their creativity from? And I said, from me. I said, well, you're a lawyer, reminded me of what the corporate lawyer. I said, well, I wanted to earn a living, but there have been some very good writers what poet am I thinking of? Edgar Lee Masters, wasn't he an attorney? Wallace, wasn't he an attorney? So I'm sick and tired of you. Mark, I'm sick of,
doctor, not a lawyer.
Was he a doctor? Okay.
Wallace Stevens.
Yeah. I'm gonna listen. I don't care if I'm not invited back. When I started college, I was an accounting major, and I graduated in accounting because it was a trade, and I wanted to have a way to make a living. And I took as a minor classics, right? And I remember this one teacher. I just couldn't get enough. She wasn't real pretty, but there was something so sexy about her. And what she said was, I know all you people from the School of Commerce are just here because there's a fulfillment requirement that you have to take a course like this. And I went over to her and I said, that's kind of offensive. I really want to be here. She says, we'll see. And I did very well in her course. And she came over to me and she said, I do owe you an apology. You're an exception because she says, you ought to change your major to classics. I said, no, I want to make a living, And then I think I asked, no, I didn't ask her out. I didn't have the nerve to ask her out, but why are you making all these memories for me? This is not fair. I mean, you know,
Charles, are you saying because the teacher was sexy, you love the subject, and so that
no,
was
no, to the contrary. I love the
I think that's what
subject.
he's really saying, man. If you read between the lines.
yeah, you didn't actually like the subject, you like the teacher.
Well, I did love my second
How was
grade
your
teacher.
Lena?
Oh, good Lord. You know, it's so interesting. The more you know, I got out of reading fiction. I was reading nonfiction, and this group has helped me get back into fiction. And when you read fiction, you realize you're not unique, which is not a bad thing. Not a bad thing. Even though everybody's life is like a fingerprint, it's all different. We all have these shared kind of accomplishments, disappointments, and I thought this book was. I mean, it quickly became one of my favorite books. You know, I really, I think I now. Has anybody? I mean, you read it as a group. Has anybody else read anything else by her?
Yes,
Willa Cather?
I was telling Ben to read A Lost Lady, because if you like, I mean, it's not the same kinds of themes exactly, but it's another really well done slice of life going back into a pioneering time with a really strong female character. And so I think if you like the sensibility, you will enjoy it.
Yeah, and I've already read Death Comes to the Archbishop, which at least in the first page of my edition says is her masterpiece. So that is the Bantam.
Did they make a movie of that?
Yeah,
Yes.
they might have, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's really interesting pioneering by a priest and down in the borderlands, yeah, between Mexico and the US and in New Mexico. So it's a new territory.
Can I ask the group a question?
Please.
Who's your favorite character in fiction?
In fiction?
Yeah.
I don't even know how to approach that.
Well, you name a name that you know that.
I have to think of that as our assignment for next time.
I've been all fiction.
It's a big,
Big,
Well, you listen. You know, I mean,
narrow down.
what's that?
Why? Who pops into your mind?
Father Francis Chisholm.
who?
Father Francis Chisholm.
And what
Uh,
Is that
It is. It's
uh,
A.J. Cronin's Keys to the Kingdom. There was a movie with Gregory Peck,
Huh.
and actually the movie is just as good. He's a missionary in China. You know, forgetting about your position on missionaries. It's just a remarkable book, and it's a
are you saying about the
remarkable book.
missionary position?
I beg your pardon?
What are you saying about the missionary position?
Get your mind off of it. You know,
I
I
it's
mean,
the Zoom, Charles. I can't do
you're
so
the
well.
one who's having these dreams about your babysitter. I don't, I mean, come on, come on.
All right, well, before we go on does anyone want to give any last thoughts or comments before I turn off the recording?
Oh my God, all this was recorded. We're gonna have to delete it.
The thoughts, did the discussion bring some light to the work?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
Well, it also, I mean, I think talking about the structure or lack thereof helped me to just accept it for what it for what it is. And I mean, I felt like it was really enchantingly told. So I mean, I enjoyed it. I don't know if it's again, I for whatever reasons, and I can't remember the story that well. I felt like I had more of a connection into the Lost Lady. But this one was interesting in its discursive rambling, it pulled together a lot of threads into an interesting mosaic.
Well, for me, I think the formlessness and the episodic nature gives it a really authentic, lived life kind of experience that just then allows us to focus on some of the subterranean issues, the unrequited love story, the inversion of traditional society values of who's nobility and who isn't. So I really enjoyed reading it again, and I will read a Lost Lady with pleasure.
Yeah, I think it's more traditional,
Yeah.
right? It's more of a traditional narrative,
Right.
but just the same. It's got a
So it's a narrative that's written by an author, and it seems like it, because it's like
Yeah.
sequential or whatnot.
yes.
Whereas this is intentionally is like a download from this character named Jim.
So should I read that or the masterpiece, the
A death that comes to the Archbishop. I don't know. I can't tell you because
That's a good question. If what attracted you was the going into the Midwest and the pioneering nature of things in Lost Lady, but there's also a little bit of that in the Archbishop going into these rugged, Mexican American communities, and but I think that if you want that American, if you want to explore more in a different story and a different angle of that American pioneer spirit, and in a story with some interest to it, I would go Lost Lady. The other one is probably, though, if you want just better literature,
anything romantic?
probably it's
Anything
got.
romantic?
I don't remember that. I mean, I think there is some romance in it, but I don't think it's romantic.
oh, she's not that kind
In
of
either
lost
one
lady.
of them, yeah. No, I don't recall.
Anything romantic with the Archbishop?
I don't think so. No, but I think most people do look at that as her best writing. So if you wanted a more literary experience, go with
Are they the
Archbishop.
same size novels? It's all kind of 200 something.
Lost Lady, I recall being not a long novel.
All right, Charles. Any last thoughts?
Have a safe trip. You have a safe trip, and I don't know if you're going anywhere, Rick, but you have a safe walk home at the very least.
All right, I'm just going to turn off the recording. You don't have to go away, but you might want to.
Actually, we're after 8:30. I gotta get back.
Yeah.